Welcome. My name is Joelle Larson. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations for the College of Science and Engineering, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to this special event in partnership with the St. Anthony Falls Lab. In years past, I've partnered with SAFL to do in-person alumni tours of the facility, but due to the space constraints of the lab, we haven't been able to bring as many alumni through to see this unique facility and all the amazing research that takes place there firsthand. And so we're really excited today to be able to welcome a larger group to share with you the history of the facility, its research priorities today, and to showcase a couple of researchers talking about their recent projects. So a couple of housekeeping matters before we begin. If you wish to listen to this webinar by phone, call-in instructions are on the screen, and they were also included in the Zoom reminder email you would have received at 11 o'clock this morning. We're going to be using the Q&A function for you to ask questions. Please do not put your questions in the chat because our panelists aren't able to see that. Put them in the question and answer box. And at the end of the presentations, we'll be doing a combined Q&A. You have the ability to upvote questions, and that will allow us to focus during the live portion of the Q&A on the ones that are most popular. And we also have some additional folks from SAFL on today who will be able to type in questions, answers to some of your questions to enable us to get through more questions than we might otherwise in the live portion. I am recording today's presentation, and a link will be shared with all registered attendees next week once we get that up on the college's YouTube channel. And when I send that out, I'll also send links that were mentioned in the presentation and other opportunities for you to be engaged with the college and with SAFL. I also have the live transcript function on today, and if you don't wish to see it, you can go down to the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and hide it. Okay. Before we get started, I want to give you just a brief outline of who's going to be speaking today and in what order. So we'll start with Lian Shen, SAFL's director, and he'll give a welcome and share a little bit of background. Then we'll turn it over to Barbara Heitkamp, SAFL's director of communications, and she'll be talking about the history of the facility, what SAFL is like today and the unique research facilities that it encompasses, and their research priorities today. Then we'll turn it over to three of the researchers who've used SAFL's facilities in the last several years. The first will be Jess Kozarek, and she'll be talking about her research into freshwater mussels using SAFL's outdoor StreamLab. Then Andy Erickson, also a research associate with SAFL. He'll be talking about road salt reduction research, and in particular the use of permeable pavement. And finally, we'll switch to Mirko Musa, a recent PhD in civil engineering, who conducted research in SAFL's main channel on hydrokinetic energy. And then we'll round it all up with some final Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lian to welcome all of you.
Hello, my name is Lian Shen, and I'm the director of the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. And I'm also a professor in mechanical engineering department. So I'm very excited to welcome our alumni to come back virtually to have a tour of our lab. And this is wonderful. And well, actually, you know, before the coronavirus, always for the past many years, the lab has been attraction, you know, for alumni, for researchers around the world, and for also the general public. So always, like each week, we have one or sometimes more tourist group touring the lab. And and due to safety concern at that time, it's like we need to limit like each group like 1,000 people, and at the same time, like at the most, you know, 4 groups in a building. And but now with this virtual thing, then actually we can host so many people at the same time. Yeah. But having said that, I still wanted to say, well, okay, I look very much to welcoming you back to visit the lab at some point when we can, and we will be more than happy to show you. And you will have a lot of personal tour guide to show that. Okay, yeah. And before I turn my microphone to Barbara, I just want to give a very quick introduction about what a Symphony Falls Laboratory is. So this lab is located by the waterfall that is in my background. And this picture actually is taken by my cell phone out of the window of my office. So we have a very good location. Okay. And the lab is under College of Science and Engineering, CSE, of University of Minnesota. And in some sense, the lab is parallel to the departments. And the idea of the lab is, we will see later in our detailed discussion, presentation, that is to promote cross-disciplinary research, to perform research related to water and air happening in nature and related to ecosystem, related to renewable energy. Okay. So the idea is to have this lab to serve the CSE, serve the faculty, serve the students, serve the researchers. And over the past many years, the lab has done a lot of wonderful stuff by the researchers in the lab. So without much ado, let me turn this to Barbara. And Barbara will be the tour guide first, and then the other people.
All right, everybody. Get my slideshow going. Everybody can see the slideshow? Thumbs up, fantastic. Well, my name is Barbara Heitkamp, and I'm the communication specialist for the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, and I'm also the one in charge of the tour program. So somewhat as Leon mentioned, we had an in-person tour program ongoing, and I spent several hours, usually of my weekend, definitely of the month, walking groups through the building. And so I'm really sad that we aren't able to actually host in-person tours at this time due to the pandemic, but it's also being able to make lemonade out of lemons, right? And so the fact that being able to bring you some content virtually, I can't show you all of the nooks and crannies of the building, but I can show you some pretty interesting parts of it. So this is a really nice graphic that actually one of Leon's students made. So obviously in the state of Minnesota, you have the Mississippi River, and we are directly on the Mississippi River. We are not located on the UMN campus. We are in Minneapolis, but we're part of this very historic Minneapolis waterfront. And so you have the position of the St. Anthony Falls, and then we are located right next to it. We get mistaken for a lot of things. We are on Hennepin Island. If you're able to see my cursor, right here is an Xcel Energy hydropower plant. And we have a diversion canal right here that actually serves the water to that hydropower plant. So we get mistaken for Xcel Energy quite a bit. We're right across from the lock and dam, right across from the river. So we've got mistaken for the Army Corps of Engineers. There is a public park right adjacent to it as well. We're in a national park in this part of the river. And so people think that we're part of the National Park Service. So it can get a little confusing. But what's really cool is that we are in this specific location for a very concrete reason. And that's the fact that we're able to actually divert water from the Mississippi River. So right here we have our little gatehouse, and we're able to divert up to 2,200 gallons per second, or roughly 300 cubic feet per second, of river water through our facility for use in experiments. So our location is very deliberate. And it came from the vision of this gentleman right here, a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Straub. He came to the University of Minnesota in 1930 as a faculty, and he was fascinated by the concept of being able to use experiments and physical models to better inform design, particularly as it relates to river hydraulics and engineering. At the time, it was very much in the 1930s, kind of thinking about how can we make rivers work and serve us. So looking at hydroelectric dams, looking at levees, looking at being able to essentially just move and direct water to where we needed it. He looked at the location. There was a pumping station on site before SAFL was there, but he was really interested in being able to find a way to build a hydraulic research laboratory utilizing the Mississippi. So in 1935, after the signing of the Works Progress Administration program to help people kind of get out of the Great Depression era, we were able to secure funding for construction of the building. And construction started in 1936, and the building was dedicated in 1938. And just because we have them, there are so many cool construction-related photos of the laboratory. So you can see this is on Hennepin Island. You can see all of the limestone that was starting to be excavated. This is where they were starting to dig out for our supply channel that fits into the building. Both the third floor and the second floor of the building are in this interesting U shape to actually accommodate for our supply channel. This right here. And so the building goes a lot deeper than you think. Like you kind of just think it's just the building kind of up on top. They actually excavated out about 30,000 pounds of limestone to create our lowermost room, which we call our turbine level. And that's because when the pumping station was here, this was the level that the turbine was at, and it stayed there for a number of years. So our basement is called the turbine level. But down here in the corner, you actually see this channel. This is the outflow channel that was designed for the pumping station, and we actually still utilize it as our outflow channel. So water comes in up on top, goes through our building, 50 feet, comes out this channel. And so this channel was actually built in the 1880s. So another just great picture, just showing the amount of workers that we had on site and just kind of the scaffolding associated with it. Just again, some really cool pictures. I will draw your attention to these guys back in here. These are flood bypass channels that actually now house a couple of our facilities. And so here's another kind of picture of that flood bypass channel. And this is the most iconic picture I think we have. If you have any t-shirt or any sort of cup or anything from us, it's probably gonna have this iconic under the Stone Arch Bridge photo. It is an outdated photo. This is the original SAFL building. We have since added a level to it, and I'll talk more a bit about that later. But this is kind of the iconic image that you would associate with SAFL. So we were dedicated in 1938. So in 2018, we celebrated our 80-year anniversary, which was a lot of fun. Again, some historic photos of what it looked like inside the building once it was constructed. Over here in the upper right, you can actually see our main channel. Love the fact that we're wearing bow ties to work. We have the Mississippi River model that was actually in the building for a number of years. Looking at how rivers move and bend. This one down in the lower right actually has significance for me. This is actually of the St. Croix River. This is Heinz Stefan, one of our faculty standing there. But this was for a study for the Allen S. King power plant. And I live in Bayport, Minnesota, so I can actually see the smokestack from that power plant out my window. And it was a study looking at how the effluent discharged by the power plant actually impacted the river's thermodynamics. And again, just some fun pictures of people working in the building. So where we now have graduate student offices, we used to have large draft rooms. You can see a nice meeting happening down here. So we have Lawrence Straub right here. Here's Alvin Anderson right here. He actually served as director of the lab at one point. You have folks essentially working together. You've got the old typewriters going on. But then as time and technology moved on, we started introducing more numerical modeling in the building. So got to enjoy the first computer setup at SAFL. So transitioning today, what's cool about SAFL is that it's continually an evolution in progress, right? And so whereas before we were affiliated under a specific department, now we are actually under the entire College of Science and Engineering, as Leanne said. And our focus has broadened from just being about primarily river hydraulics to being more generally about fluid mechanics. And so looking at the behavior and nature of not just water, but air and fluids in general, blood flow through the body. We've had faculty that work in health applications as well. And so it's really a testament to the fact that as society continues to change, SAFL continues to change as well. And I think that's one of our greatest strengths. We've been the home for several major national research initiatives. One of them was the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics, which is a National Science Foundation Science and Technology Center that really helped bring SAFL on the map, especially in the early 2000s. It was a center from 2002 to 2012. And we also have this ELOS Wind Energy Research Consortium as well. So we do actually own and operate a full-scale research wind turbine, obviously not located on site, but we're able to integrate that in a lot of our energy research. We did actually recently finish a $6 million renovation that started in 2012 to 2014. It's pretty much an 80-year-old building, hadn't had any significant updates through a lot of decades, and so being able to help improve the infrastructure as well as being able to make some needed research updates to continually just bring SAFL into the future, right? How we generally operate. So we have 15 faculty from the college that are associated with SAFL. So they have a home department, but bring their research groups to SAFL to conduct the research. So we have them from civil, environmental and geoengineering, earth and environmental sciences. We have them from mechanical engineering as well as aerospace engineering, and they bring their research groups to SAFL. So we have a nice large student group that works at SAFL. And aside from that, we also have our own applied research team at SAFL as well. So we have both a permanent staff, and then the faculty are able to bring in their projects as well. So where we're kind of focused now in terms of what we study. So we have fundamental fluid mechanics. So again, we have this interplay of both basic research where you're looking just to expand the knowledge of a field, but we also do a lot of applied research. And so research that's going to be input into a real-time process right now. So in fundamental fluid mechanics, we do a lot in atmospheric flows. So just understanding the turbulence and nature of how air moves in the lower atmosphere. Multi-phase interactions, so where you have essentially two fluids of different densities or properties interacting with one another. Turbulence, we do a lot of sensor development and technology innovation. In the environment, obviously a lot of complex environmental issues right now as it relates to climate change and the health and sustainability and management of a lot of our water bodies. So we work in lakes, rivers, groundwater, we work in the ocean, we work with deltas and the vulnerable environments that they are in. We're looking at the interplay of water, sediment, vegetation, and other aquatic organisms as well as how do we as humans live on this landscape, and how do we promote solutions that kind of help deal with the fact that we as humans continue to modify and change our environment. And then also looking into wind power, wind energy, water power as it relates to traditional hydropower, as well as innovations in that, which Mirko's going to talk a lot about. And then carbon-based power. So we've worked in more oil and gas related applications in the past, and also looking at biofuels as well. So what do we have? What's in the building? We have some amazing research facilities, right? And so a lot of people on tours ask me, well, what really makes SAFL unique? The research facilities are definitely a very important part of that equation. So we have numerous flumes and channels that we're able to use for research. We have modeling basins, we have a couple water tunnels, we have a wind tunnel, and we have the ability to create instrumentation that takes really high quality, detailed measurements, as well as we're able to calibrate as well. And so we have a really good understanding of what's coming in the building, how do we make sure that we're collecting that high quality data. We have our outdoor StreamLab, and we do have a full machine and fabrication shop on site. I like to call us the original makerspace, since that is very much an in vogue thing right now, to have these spaces where you have access to a lot of different resources and equipment. We have had that since the beginning. So we like to consider ourselves an experimentalist stream. But aside from the facility, you're going to find a lot of these different types of facilities at other institutions, but I think something that really does make us unique is not just the scale of the facilities we have, but the people who work here as well. And so again, speaking to that applied engineering team and those who help the faculty and their students with research as well as doing their own research projects, we're able to fabricate flumes, we're able to create something out of nothing, which is something that really makes SAFL exciting, right? But we also have the ability to have all these folks involved in research, which is honestly a lot of fun. So the legacy of expertise, as well as the facilities itself, is what makes it really exciting to work at SAFL. One thing that I'm not able to usually show on a physical tour is talking about our computational capabilities. And so as we've gotten the advent of supercomputers, SAFL has really kind of worked into being able to do this computational fluid dynamics. So Leon, our director, works a lot in CFD. One of the things we do at SAFL when we approach a research problem, we have the ability to approach it from a laboratory, an experimental sort of framework. We're able to have people go out in the field and collect data and do really great field work, but then being able to incorporate these numerical approaches as well. Essentially, you're attacking a problem from a lot of different angles and creating these really robust research packages, which really kind of makes what comes out of our laboratory a really high standard of work. So kind of, again, giving you some pictures of what's actually in the building. So up in the top middle here, this is our auditorium. It is the original 1938 auditorium. Those wood chairs are very uncomfortable and they all have right-handed desks. We don't believe in left-handed people. But it's a really cool space. You can see that we have the chalkboard here. We refuse to get rid of the chalkboard. Everybody doesn't mind getting chalk on their fingers. So we have this original space here. Here I am giving a tour at what we call our scenic viewpoint. So this is actually where you can see where the supply channel comes in and you can look down and see the outflow channel. So you have the full 50-foot drop of the St. Anthony Falls kind of at this viewpoint. And then just a few other pictures of experiments and people kind of in the building. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull out a couple of these really unique facilities that everybody wants to see when they come in the building. It is limited. I'm not going to be able to go through everything at all. So I'm just choosing a few, especially of the ones of the research that we see focused on today, the ones that you're going to be hearing talked about. So here's our main channel. It's original to the building. It is the flume that can handle the most amount of flow diverted from the Mississippi River, up to that 300 CFS. And so that is Mississippi River water that you see in it. So it's really cool to be able to turn the river on, so to speak. And so here it is turned on. So this was during a summer workshop that we had for some aspiring academic professionals. And we needed to flush the main channel that day from an experiment that we had been doing on channel elevation that had a really steep slope. So we just welcomed everybody downstairs to essentially kind of watch the bed be eroded. And so they're able to see some really interesting geomorphic features and flows just in this flush. It is one of the largest research channels in the US, so we have a lot of external folks come and use it from time to time. It does have sediment recirculation, and so we are always very cognizant that when we bring the river in, we don't want to discharge it back downstream with anything in it that we can avoid. So we do have a sediment settling basin at the downstream end of the main channel, and we also have a sediment recirculation system. And so that's a nice kind of cost-effective use of being able to say, well, if we're going to input sediments, obviously then we're going to be able to collect that sediment and recirculate it back up to the top. And so this is something that a lot of our research channels and flumes have the ability to do. The outdoor StreamLab is another facility you're going to hear about today. So this is a facility that came online in 2008. It was part of the that National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics from the National Science Foundation. They helped fund the creation of this facility. And what it is, it's on one of those, the flood bypass channels that you saw in the historic photos. And what we have here is an experimental stream and floodplain system. And the cool thing is that we get the best of both worlds. And so it's a step between the field and the laboratory. In the laboratory, we can control most of the variables, right? But then when you go out in the field, essentially you're observing the environment. You don't get to control much. Here in the OSL, we can actually control the amount of flow and sediment coming into the system. We can't control natural sunlight and vegetation. We have seeded it with native prairie vegetation. We do have to go out and weed it from time to time because invasive vegetation does make it in. So we kind of get more of the ecological component in a lot of our experiments that you're not going to be able to replicate in a laboratory environment. We also have underneath this tarp right here, this tent, we have one of our data carriages. And so this is a system that was designed at SAFL, and it enables us to collect really high resolution measurements of topography, or just very systematically take data of velocity, or essentially just kind of whatever sensor we're able to move on those carts. They know where they are in 3D space. And so just a super cool facility where we're able to collect a lot of high resolution data. I do have a time lapse of a flood that we did in the OSL, so we have the ability to flood this entire basin irrespective of what the main channel of the Mississippi River is doing. So we can do it in the middle of the summer, we can do it in the fall. And so they were doing, in this particular experiment, looking at denitrification, and so wanted to be able to flood the channel and floodplain and take it back down. You'll see these piezometers, these kind of white tubes that are in the floodplain, so we can monitor subsurface conditions. Another one that I want to mention is our wind tunnel. So the wind tunnel is a facility that is not original to the building. It's kind of offers this cool step of, again, how SAFL has evolved over the decades. And so this was a facility that was built in the mid-1980s. And designed to essentially study boundary layer effects on natural and urban environments. It can be either a closed loop or an open loop system. The fan that initiates the wind is Joy right over here, and we can actually have wind speeds reach up to 148 feet per second in the wind tunnel. It is temperature controlled as well, and so that's obviously a variable for a lot of different experiments, and so we do have that control. A lot of the research in the wind tunnel is related to wind farm and wind farm siting. So making sure that the wakes behind a wind turbine, so as you have air approaching the wind turbine, the air structure behind the turbine is obviously disrupted because of the interaction with the blades. How does that wake impact power generation of surrounding wind turbines? And so we can play with different configurations. So just a really nice facility to have, especially since we have a full-scale research wind turbine, which we gave a tour on earlier this year. There is a YouTube video about that. So if you're interested more in about our wind turbine and the research associated with that, we'll make sure to include that link. One other thing that we do is that we are able to construct facilities as needed. So we have a space in the laboratory called the model floor. And in the model floor, we can essentially construct whatever we need in order for an experiment. In 2011, there was a very large flood in Minot, North Dakota. It necessitated the evacuation of over 10,000 people. And so in redesigning that flooding infrastructure, we were asked to construct a model of a proposed pumping station. And so the time lapse you see down in the corner of them constructing a 1:7 model of that proposed station. And essentially what we're looking at and what physical models are designed to do is before you go to full construction, you want to have a good idea of whether or not your design is going to actually work the way you intend for it to work. And so that's a niche we can fill. So being able to offer suggestions, improvements, recommendations before going to full scale. And this proposed pumping station, I believe, is actually under construction as we speak in Minot. So another cool building thing, and one thing that I love for giving tours at a particular time of year, Straub recognized that in constructing a building on an island in the river, especially the mighty Mississippi River, we're going to have to deal with flooding for part of the time. And so instead of fighting to keep the water out, he actually designed the building to let the water in. So here is a picture of our basement, or the turbine level as I called it. And all along this striped floor here, these are floating floor tiles. And when the river of the Mississippi River gets to about 30,000 or so, between 30 and 32,000 CFS, water backs up and comes into our building. And so it's just a time of the year that we know we have to clear the floor and make sure that nothing gets negatively impacted. The most amount of water that's ever been here is about 5 feet. And that was in the 1965 flood that we experienced here in Minnesota. But a lot of times we might just get a few inches of water kind of surging up and in. But other times we get enough feet that sometimes some of our researchers just want to take a nice little kayak break down in the basement. So this is actually Jess Kozarek, who I'm going to be turning this over to in just a minute. And she's taking a kayak around the basement floor. So just a really interesting kind of more sustainable design aspect of SAFL is just the fact that in recognizing even in the 1930s that you got to work with the river, not against it, right? All right, so this is where I'm actually going to turn things over to our researchers. So Joelle already introduced them, but we're going to be starting with Jess and then moving to Andy and then Mirko. Andy Erickson as well is also an alumni of the U. And so it's really nice to see an alumni be able to stick around and find their niche here with us. And one thing I do want to mention about Mirko, and so he actually was recently awarded the best dissertation in physical sciences and engineering by the UMN Graduate School. And so his dissertation research, which he's going to be talking about, really gets the thumbs up. So with that, Jess, I'm going to turn it over to you. I will still be the one that is turning the slides, but I'll mute myself and you can go for it.
Okay. All right, so I should mention I am not a U alum, but both of my parents are. So anyway, so I thought today I would spend a little bit more time talking about a set of experiments we did in the outdoor StreamLab. And these were, I'm going to use freshwater mussels as an example of experiments that we've conducted that link hydrology or water flow to and sediment transport processes to biota, or the organisms living within streams. And when I say freshwater mussels, I'm talking about our native freshwater mussels. So there's a picture of one here in the corner. And these are organisms, they're distinct from our invasive zebra mussels, which we tend to hear a whole lot more about than our native freshwater mussels. So, oh, next slide. So here's this is a picture of a freshwater mussel bed in the Ottertail River. This was provided to me by Mike Davis from the Minnesota DNR. And this is a pretty dense freshwater mussel bed. Next slide. And you can see a couple things happening here, and this is why freshwater mussels are really a really important part of our river ecosystems. These mussels are actively filtering. You can see that their shells are gaped open a little bit, and so this filter feeding can improve the water quality. It can also move nutrients from the water column down into the sediment, which creates nutrients that are needed to create food for fish and aquatic insects. And then you can think about the physical presence of the mussels themselves can help to stabilize the riverbed through floods and large flow events. Next slide. So the project I'm talking about today was a fairly large interdisciplinary project between myself and my colleagues at Macalester College, Dan Hornbach, Kelly McGregor, and Mark Hovey. It was funded by the Minnesota's Environmental Natural Resources and Trust Fund. We had a large number of undergraduate researchers who worked on the project, input from Minnesota DNR, from United States Geological Survey, and from other colleagues at SAFL. Next slide. So freshwater mussels are highly imperiled in Minnesota. We have about 41 species, I don't remember the exact number, but about 41 species of native freshwater mussels. 5 of those are on the federally endangered list. There's an additional 19 that are listed as threatened or endangered just in Minnesota. And of course, Minnesota DNR has a full website, a full list of these mussel species on their website. But if you didn't know, freshwater mussels were actually heavily decimated in the late 1800s when a lot of these large rivers were dredged in order to pull up the mussel shells for the button making industry. So freshwater mussels were collected for their shells to make pearl buttons. And I also need to mention that freshwater mussels, they have a very unique life cycle where an adult freshwater mussel has various adaptations in order to attract fish to come close to it. It then releases its glaucidia or larvae, which attach to fish gills, and the glaucidia live there for a number of weeks before they drop off as juvenile mussels, and then start a new mussel colony. And so this video that's playing in the upper right corner This shows one of these adaptations where this freshwater mussel has a lure that looks a lot like a minnow. It even has an eye spot that it waves around in the water in order to try to attract fish to come close to it so that it has successful, so that the Glaucidia can successfully attach to the fish gills. If you have some spare time, there's a lot of videos out there with a lot of different adaptations for mussels, and it's really fascinating to watch. Some of them look like crayfish, some mussels clamp down on the fish. There's a whole variety there. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, though. Today I want to talk about these experiments that we did at the Outdoor StreamLab that looked at how mussels respond to changing environmental conditions. So in this case, we're really looking at flood flows. So flood flows that carry high, fast velocities of water and high levels of sediment, both in terms of bed load, or the sediment that's moving along the bed, but also the suspended sediment. And we're looking at how the mussels themselves can respond to these large flow events, either through behavioral response, so how does it change their feeding or their movement patterns, but also the metabolic response. So how does the glycogen or the energy store within the mussel change when they're exposed to what can be stressful events. Oh, next slide. And so mussels live on the stream bed. And so their presence interacts with the flow near the stream bed, which can alter the local flow and the sediment transport in the vicinity of the stream bed. Next slide. So again, we used the Outdoor StreamLab and Flumes at St. Anthony Falls Laboratory to ask these questions. Here's a picture of the Outdoor StreamLab and the location of our test mussel bed. Next slide. Okay, so here's a video of one of our flood events in the Outdoor StreamLab, and you'll see a mussel in the upper left-hand corner. You'll notice a couple things right away. The mussel is painted white, and we did that so that we could see the mussel both through video, through the water surface, so that we could track them and see what was going on. The mussel also has a small white heart that's glued to it. Each mussel was uniquely identified using different colored sequins or different shapes of sequins. And each mussel has a tail. That's a piece of floating fly fishing line. And we used that so that we could find the mussels if they were buried underneath the sediment, so that you know, we could identify the string that was sticking up and figure out how far down the mussels were buried. The figure on the upper right shows the white dots are the original locations of the mussels at the start of the flood. The gray dots are the locations of the mussels after the flood. And you'll notice that generally speaking, the mussels didn't move much during the flood. They're very close to their original positions. But what you can see along this red line, that's a transect that we're showing in this animation down below. And thank you, Barbara. And so this is a transect of data that was collected using a sonar. So basically it's showing how the bed is changing over this flood event. So you can see that we have these bed forms or sand waves that are moving along the channel. And that the mussels, you can see 3 mussels in this image. They look like this, yep, thank you, these trapezoidal shapes that are sticking up. And so during the flood, the mussels are constantly getting buried and then unburied and then buried again, but the position isn't changing much. They might be burrowing down a little bit deeper into the sediment, but mostly they're holding their position. Okay, next slide. And this burrowing behavior changes by species, and by species we also have variation in the shell shape, size, density, and sculpture. So here's 3 very common species of freshwater mussel in Minnesota: a 3-ridge, the plain pocketbook, and the white heel splitter. So the 3-ridge has ridges, which in theory would help it anchor within the sediment. The plain pocketbook is very inflated, so it's got a large diameter, and the white heel splitter is very, very thin. And so these mussels tend to be found in different environments, and it's thought that has something to do with the local sediment stability of where the mussels are found. Next slide. Okay, so after the flood, so during the flood, mussels burrowed and they kind of held their position, but after the flood, what we found is that the mussels, if they were in a position that they didn't like to be, they tried to look for a better place. Most of the time, this was looking for deeper water. So after the flood, as the depth of the water came down, they started to hunt for deeper water. We did do some experiments where we removed the deeper water areas, and that's what you're seeing here. This is a time lapse over a couple hours. And you can see that the mussels are actually moving quite a bit, and they're looking for deeper water, but as there isn't any deeper water present, they're kind of moving in random directions. Next slide. So we also, that's okay, go ahead. Okay, so we also looked at mussel feeding behavior. And to do that, we instrumented all of our mussels to look at their gape. Are they open or are they closed, and how is that changing with sediment? And so one thing that we saw a lot of as sediment increased, we saw a lot more very quick closure events, which meant that the mussels were basically spitting out sediment. And so we could pick that up in the signal that we got from these gape sensors, whether the mussels were open or closed. And so you can go on to the next slide. So again, this is just an example of the kind of experiments we can do in the outdoor StreamLab. The outdoor StreamLab, one of its big advantages is that we can incorporate biology into our studies of rivers and streams. And so I talked about mussels here, but we've done similar kind of experiments looking at the feedbacks between vegetation growth and channel morphology, for example. And so we found that these mussels, they responded to changing environmental conditions, but the adult mussels that we studied here were generally able to handle the flood flows that we were able to throw at them. But when you look at the whole watershed scale, you have to think about these mussels are exposed to many interacting stressors, both at different life stages, but also with water quality, habitat loss, sedimentation, channel modification, host fish availability, and invasive species impact, so competition with zebra mussels. And so there's still a lot that we have left to learn about freshwater mussels. So I'm out of time. I could talk about this for a lot longer, but I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to my colleague, Andy Erickson.
Very good. Thanks, Jessica. Hello and welcome. Again, my name is Andy Erickson, Research Associate here at St. Anthony Falls Lab. Today I'm going to talk about a project that's actually an example of field research that we do out of St. Anthony Falls Lab, and this is on permeable pavements, specifically for road salt reduction. And maybe some of you have seen what permeable pavements are, maybe some of you haven't, so I'll talk about that on the next slide. What we use permeable pavements for is as a replacement for conventional pavements. And they can be asphalt, they can be concrete, they could be block pavers. Maybe some of you have some of these in your neighborhoods. There's a number of them in Minnesota, but also around the world as well. Some of the key benefits for permeable pavements is that they provide volume reduction in stormwater runoff. So during rain events, the purpose of permeable pavements is to allow the rain to actually go through the pavement as opposed to running off onto the side slopes. And so that's the key benefit. It reduces the volume of runoff from these streets and paved areas. As a result, it also improves water quality because there's less water washing off the roads, there are less pollutants being washed off the road. And again, because there's less water, we have less hydroplaning. So there's a resistance to hydroplaning for vehicles, improved safety. We also see less spray, and that's actually what's demonstrated here in the photos on the right side of the screen. On the top photo is a conventional or an impermeable pavement, and on the bottom is a permeable pavement. And you can see it's actually the same drive, the same vehicle. You can see the large truck in the photo, in both photos, and you can see the amount of spray in the impermeable pavement compared to no spray for the permeable pavement. And that's again because there's less volume of water on the surface of the pavement during these rain events. And as such, we have increased visibility. We also see a smoother riding surface. So as you're driving on the roadway, there's less bumps and vibrations and less noise, or there's less noise coming from the vehicles because a lot of the sound is actually going into those permeable spaces in the pavement. What we wanted to address in our research was, is there a winter benefit? Can we apply less road salt which actually ends up in the environment, in our groundwater and our surface waters, if we have permeable pavement compared to conventional pavement. So on the next slide, I can show you how we did this. We started with some previous research that was done by Wenck Associates and the city of Robbinsdale here in Minnesota. They collected some preliminary data to kind of look at, is this even really a feasible question to ask? Is there really any winter benefit? And from this photo, you can see in the foreground a conventional, non-porous or impermeable pavement that was not salted, compared to a permeable pavement in the background of this photo. And just visually, we can see more snow and ice on the impermeable pavement compared to the permeable. But from the photo, it can be hard to quantify. What is the percent benefit? What is the quantitative benefit here? And is this just this particular situation, this day, these climate conditions? Or is this more persistent? How often does this happen? So then we took data and we looked at other information that they collected and collected more data to it. So the next slide will show some temperature data that's actually collected throughout the pavement. So there was temperature sensors installed right near the surface of the pavement, and then at several increments all the way down to about 18 inches below the pavement surface. And these two plots, on the left is the impermeable asphalt or impermeable pavement section, and the same range of dates on the permeable section on the right. And I've highlighted just a few peaks to kind of demonstrate the differences between these. So first, when the surface of the pavement is warm, so during warm weather, again, this is winter, you can see the dates here in January of 2012, so it's still winter conditions, but relatively, when the temperature is warm, the permeable pavement surface is warmer than the conventional pavement. And also during cold situations, when the pavement surface is cold, the permeable pavement is actually colder than the impermeable pavement. So that was quite interesting. The surface temperature of these permeable pavements changes more than a conventional pavement. On the next slide, we can see that also the difference in temperature between the surface and below the surface, in this case just to about 18 inches below, there's actually a larger difference in temperature as well on the permeable pavement on the right compared to the conventional or impermeable pavement on the left. And what these two graphs really tell us is that permeable pavements are insulating. They are preventing the heat from moving either from the surface down towards the ground or from the ground up to the surface. They are preventing that movement of heat, and that can have a big impact on what the surface conditions of the pavement are. That's kind of an example of the fundamental aspects. What are the thermodynamics of these pavement sections? But at the end of the day, we really want to know, is the pavement safe to drive on? So on the next slide, I introduce how we measured friction measurements to quantify that safety. Because you can still have a little snow or ice on a pavement and you can have good traction, good stopping distance, good road safety. And in other cases, maybe not. So we wanted to measure friction to measure that. And this is using a portable friction tester called the T2Go. It's a relatively small device that you just push along the surface. It measures the friction in real time, as well as the surface temperature, air temperature, relative humidity, and other things. We will focus on the friction, which on the next slide is an example from the Maplewood Public Works facility, where the parking lot is permeable asphalt, and that's shown on the left, and the drive lanes coming into the parking lot are impermeable asphalt or conventional asphalt. All of the sites, and we measured friction on 22 different sites around the Twin Cities metropolitan area, have cases where a permeable pavement is immediately adjacent to an impermeable pavement, because we wanted the climatic conditions to be exactly the same for all of our measurements when comparing these two pavement types. In this case in Maplewood, we actually applied some water on the surface just to measure how much would soak in versus how much would freeze on the surface. And this test was done while the temperature was below freezing. And in the photos, you can see on the outsides of the slide, in the center is actually a map showing the friction. So if it's a red color, it has more friction or good friction. If it is more of a blue color, it has low friction, or in other words, more ice on the surface. And just visually from this, the photos and the graphics demonstrate that there's more ice on the impermeable pavement. And so that demonstrated that these porous surfaces, even if the temperature is cold, can allow water to soak through those pavements. On the next slide is another example from another site. This is actually the city of Falcon Heights. Their drive lane, in this case, the drive lane is the permeable section, and some of their parking areas are the impermeable section. So the impermeable pavement is the photo on the top and the graph on the top of this slide. And overall, in this case, I'm showing actually line graphs to demonstrate the friction. Friction becomes dangerous when the friction factor gets to about 0.35 is when you should start using caution. And when it's below 0.25, then it's actually very dangerous. And there were instances here, you can see in the photos, snow and ice on the pavement surfaces, and you can see in the friction graphs, we would dip below some of those criteria. Also, overall, when you compare these two sites, you can see visually and in the friction measurement, there's less snow and ice on the impermeable pavement in the top compared to the permeable pavement on the bottom. But another big distinction is that there is meltwater pooling on the impermeable surfaces. And that's very important to note. When these measurements were taken on this particular day, it was above freezing during the day and below freezing at night. And so the snow and ice would melt on the impermeable pavements and pool there and then refreeze overnight. Whereas on the permeable pavements, there was no meltwater. As soon as the water would melt, it would soak through the permeable pore spaces in that pavement and disappear. And so on the next slide, that led to our conclusions from this report. Permeable pavements, as we saw in the early slides, function as thermal insulators. They prevent the heat from moving up and down through the pavement. So when the weather's warm, permeable pavements will be warmer on the surface. When the weather is cold, permeable pavements will be colder. Also, and I didn't get to show this just due to time constraints, we found some permeable pavements that were clogged with sediment, and some of the pores can get collapsed due to poor construction. They're not permeable anymore, so they really do not provide any winter benefit in terms of allowing that meltwater to flow through. But if the permeable pavements are functioning as they were originally designed, then they can infiltrate the meltwater, and that is the primary winter benefit for these permeable pavements. So we can reduce our salt application rates and our salt impacts on our environment by using our permeable pavements. If you're interested in this information and these types of projects, we have an email newsletter called Stormwater Updates. It actually presents on projects related to stormwater research across the University of Minnesota. You can find past articles and sign up for the Updates newsletter at the website shown here and copy and paste it into the chat. You can see also updates on our Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series, which is shown here on this slide. This was started in 2019, and it's an effort to bring nationally recognized experts in stormwater and green infrastructure innovation and advancement to Minnesota to give a presentation. In recent months, it's been completely online, but since the beginning, it has been streamed and recorded via Zoom. So you can find past recordings at our YouTube channel by searching for Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series or using either of the links on the screen here. And as you can see, we've had a host of nationally recognized experts give our keynote talks. We then put them on a panel discussion with local experts to talk about how do we implement these things in Minnesota. So if you're interested, I encourage you to check out the websites and follow us on YouTube. And with that, that concludes my portion, and it's my pleasure to turn the stage over now to Mirko. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Hello, everybody. My name is Mirko Musa. I'm also an alum of the University of Minnesota. I graduated now more than a year ago in civil engineering in water resource program. And I spent almost 5 years working at SAFL on my research on marine and hydrokinetic energy. So before I move on, I should probably introduce what MHK is, what marine and hydrokinetic technology is. It's a fairly new technology that produces renewable energy, harnessing the movement of the water. And the movement can come from waves, so harnessing the oscillating motion, or from the flow itself, from currents. Currents that could be tidal, could be riverine, or could be ocean. And specifically in my research, I focus on the second part in the current converters, as you can see from the next slide. The working mechanism is fundamentally extremely similar to the more known wind energy. As you can tell from the geometry of the device and from the devices that are surrounding me in my background, that really resemble like a wind turbine with the rudder and the 3 blades that harness the fluid. So as I was saying, the working principle is very similar. So a fluid, in this case water, spins this blade, spins this rudder, which is connected to a generator, which generates electricity. And as you can see here from from this equation, the power that you can extract is directly related to the size of your device through the area A, that is the area swept by the blades. But most importantly, because it's at the power of 3, the velocity of your fluid. Next slide. Before I show you what I did, I want to give you a little bit of background on the advantages and the current obstacle of this technology. So MHK can be perceived as a more eco-friendly alternative of the more conventional hydro. Because it doesn't require a dam. So in conventional hydro, you would block a river to create energy from water, but you would block all the natural processes as well. So creating some potential environmental problems. Also, it's a very predictable source. Now we have a good understanding of tides and rivers. And also, water bodies are close to population all over the world. So it could be really a good alternative for remote regions or developing countries. As you can tell here from that, however, despite of a good theoretical resource, as you can see here from the table, the technical recoverable energy is quite low, especially for rivers. And this brings me to the first obstacles that this technology faces. As I said, it's a nascent technology. So right now, the industry is at its early stage. So there's low efficiency and a lack of optimization in design. So there's a zoo of devices right now. And this, together with the uncertainties surrounding the uncertainties for the environmental impacts and the social impacts, makes the cost of this technology not yet competitive with the more conventional energy resources or the renewable energy alternatives. So for this reason, in my research, that I'll show you in the next slide, first of all, I wanted to try to encourage the application of this technology to rivers, because rivers are everywhere. And we try, in my research, we try to answer to one of these uncertainties, specifically the interaction of these turbines with the physical environment where they're installed in, such as the erodible bathymetry or the river shape, the river morphology, and so on. And we started that by looking at this local scour induced by a turbine. And we did that experimentally at SAFL using 2 scales, 2 turbine models at 2 different scales in 2 different channels, and looking and quantifying the scour and the spatial extension of this disturbance. And we realized that qualitatively, this scour looks like a more common bridge pier scour that has been extensively studied in the past. But quantitatively, it's way more enhanced because the turbine introduces more turbulence and more motion and more chaotic motions. So for this reason, we wanted to, we extended the study to a more theoretical level in the next slide. And so we were able to come up with equation with a model that could predict this local scour depending on the hydraulic condition of the channel, the sediment characteristic, but most importantly, the turbine operating condition, which is the key difference between a turbine and a static object like a bridge pier. And knowing the scour ahead is important not only for environmental purposes, but also during the design to know for the structural safety of the turbine. And then in the next slide, I will show you that these turbines in real life will have to be deployed in arrays, so in groups of turbines to make the technology economically viable and produce enough energy. So we decided to place 12 of these little models in the main channel, the big channel that Barbara showed you before. And we recreated a real river scenario in flooding conditions. So with strong current, big depths with respect to the size of the turbine, and intense sediment transport. So with the sand dunes that you can see here in the video, moving through the array and in the channel. The channel is that gray area that you see, and those two stripes, two segments, are the two segments of bed forms and bathymetry that we were able to measure. So for this reason, next slide. In the next slide, I show you we did measure the interaction of the turbines with the sediment transport by looking at the time evolution of the bathymetry using this amazing submergible laser scanning device that was designed and developed at SAFL. And so we were able to make these videos that you can see here on the right. But also we wanted to measure some other parameters that are important for an array design, such as the wake recovery. Barbara touched on this earlier for wind, and it's a very similar concept here. So behind the turbine, you have a region called wake where the velocity of the flow slows down because the turbine is extracting energy. And so the wake recovery is the longitudinal distance at which the fluid starts acting like the undisturbed one. And so that's the distance where you want to place your next turbine. And also we measure a little bit the distribution, the power distribution within the array. These are all parameters that are informative to know, informative for the array sizing and the array siting, so for the design. And what we found in the next slide is that the presence of the array does introduce statistically some perturbation in the river, so that can lead to changes in the river shape and then the river dynamic downstream of your turbines. However, we also found that if we minimize the lateral obstruction of your array, so the lateral obstruction of the array within the river width, we can minimize these potential effects, making it potentially not important. And also we found that despite of the complexity of our river system, so with the changing bathymetry and moving sand, all the other parameters that I mentioned really resembled our findings resemble what other researchers found for wind arrays. So that's important because then we can take that knowledge and apply it here for MHK designs. And finally, probably my favorite result is that we found that can you go back one slide? Is that the self-defense mechanism. So the turbines have a self-defense mechanism. So basically we realized, remember that we were running these experiments in flooding scenarios, so with intense sediment transport and with dunes that sometimes were as high as the blade level, which is this red region in the video. And so we realized that the same mechanism that was responsible for the local scour was acting here as a self-defense. So it was eroding incoming dunes and so preventing them from encroaching on the blades. And finally, so my last slide is what I started doing at the end of my PhD, and this is a research that I'm still collaborating with SAFL on, and is we started to think of installing the turbines in a river in a synergistically, so in a more thought way, so that we can not only minimize the environmental impacts, but maybe benefit, so take benefits for the river from this installation. So we, like, for instance, we started thinking of installing these turbines on one side, on the stream bank side, such as while the turbine is extracting energy and producing renewable energy, is also protecting the side bank from side erosion especially in the external side part of a river meander, so that we can take this like co-development opportunity of creating energy and river engineering and river protection. And with this, I conclude my presentation. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A and we'll answer them at the end. And now I'll turn the mic to Barbara. Thank you so much for attending.
Well, I will say this, just like actual SAFL tours that we have at the building, we're running a little bit behind. We hope to have a little bit more time for Q&A. So I just have a couple slides to wrap up here, and then we'll get to some of that Q&A. So what it really comes down to is that here at SAFL, we're people that are not only interested and curious about being able to forward the fields of knowledge, but very much about interacting with both local partners and in the state, but also beyond that as well. And so it's all about moving research to practice, and we take very seriously this mission to be able to help educate and mentor and inspire the next generation of researchers, while also being able to provide good research products and information that can be used by people. One of the things I love most about the lab, though, is that you never know what's going to come in the door next. And we actually are in the middle, at the very end of a crowdsourcing campaign. There have been a lot of concerns in Minnesota recently and throughout the Midwest that as we start getting larger watercraft on our lakes, the wakes from them actually can potentially lead to issues with degrading ecosystems, shorelines, and also lake bottoms. And so we had approached the legislature about funding this research, and things kind of didn't move through. But there's a lot of lake associations who are just like, we're on board with being able to really start addressing this critical data gap. And so we've been able, this is actually from a couple days ago, it's now up over $124,000. So it just really goes to show that SAFL is all about being able to kind of meet where people are at and make sure that we're addressing things that society really cares about. So with that, I will wrap up my section as well and stop sharing my screen. But we recently launched a new website at safl.umn.edu. We are on all the social medias, and I'm the one who generally controls those. And so I do try to post updates, especially as now we don't have as many researchers in the building, but there is still research ongoing. So you might not be able to come visit us at the lab, but we're dedicated to making sure that people know more about us, and definitely are always going to try to pull back that black box of what is that place and what do they do there. So really appreciate your time and attention. All right. All right, so I see some Q&As up there. All right, and Leon, if you're still online, actually, I'm going to direct this question to you. So how has the WOW computational technique been applied to freshwater lakes, and what types of projects? So it's great that you're online, because I know you can answer that question.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Well, I'll be happy to answer this question. And well, as you can imagine, the WOW has been applied to a lot of ocean focused research funded by National Science Foundation, funded by the Department of Energy for offshore wind energy applications, and the US Navy. Okay. And now the question is about lakes, freshwater lakes, what kind of projects we have. I'll give you two examples. One is funded by Minnesota Sea Grant. So that is a part of the NOAA, okay? And what we are going to study is to what's called a ripple current. So therefore, you know, it's like all of a sudden we are in research that is saving people's life. So that is Lake Superior and the South Shore. And then we are going to study how the waves break and then that generate offshore current, so that will be very dangerous to the swimmers. Okay. So that is an ongoing project. And another project that just got started very recently, a couple of months ago, funded by National Science Foundation. And we are using WOW to study how the water vapor goes from the lake to the atmosphere. And so that is a freshwater lake project. And well, I very much look forward to more opportunities using WOW codes to study lakes.
Thank you, Leon. Another question here that I think is for you, Jess. So with the disruption to natural river bedding, do you see a disruption to the river's ecology? Actually, that could also be a Mirko question as well.
Yeah, I was actually typing the answer, but at this point I can answer.
Go for it. Answer
so
live.
we don't know we didn't look at exactly the correlation between how the disrupted bed will affect the ecology, but we know now that benthic communities relies on sediment, and so if you're even like a local scour can affect the benthic community because you're disrupting the sediment and the substrate. So that's the fundamental reason why we started looking at that's why we started looking at scours and the changing in the morphology. Now this is locally, so that locally has a problem on the benthic communities, but potentially when you mess up with the sediment transport, with the sediment continuity, there's theory that shows that you might change the actual shape of the river and the dynamics. So the river might start eroding on one spot, depositing on another spot, and so start creating a new course. And obviously you don't want that, both for ecological reason and also for safety of your community around the river.
Thanks a lot, Mirko. Jessica,
Yep.
Did you have anything?
No, I think he covered it.
All right, very good. So Mirko, it looks like there's another one here for you as well. Not sure if this was covered. Are there any studies of kinetic turbine use in sewer systems, sanitary or storm? Ooh, that could be an Andy question too. I love these questions.
Not that I know of, specifically in the sewers. I don't. Well, I know that like the DOE and people are starting to be interested in man-made canals or agricultural canals, because those are concrete canals, so that you don't have any natural disruption anymore because it's man-made, and you have usually fast flows there. So those are actually good candidates for hydrokinetic energy. Although the drawback is always the resistance. So if you add a turbine, and this could be a problem even for sewer canals, and Andy can expand on this, but if you put a turbine, you put a resistance in the canal, in the pipe, and so you increase you're slowing down the flow. So that could be a problem.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, the other thing is many of these storm sewer systems are designed, like Mirko said, for a specific flow, and any kind of resistance and slowing that down could cause flooding upstream. And as an obstruction to the flow, a physical obstruction, other debris in the flow could get caught and then further clog or plug up the pipe. So I haven't seen it used in storm sewer pipes, although I have seen it in tidal pipes where tides come in and out. I've seen it in those kind of situations where it's not always one directional flow, but it is two directional flow and things like that. So there are some situations where they've used these in pipes.
I have a couple permeable pavement questions for you, Andy. So how does permeable pavement hold up to high track traffic, or ESALs? Yeah,
that's a great question. And that actually somebody else asked a similar question about applications of permeable pavements. So conventional pavements, as we know, is used across the board for high traffic, low traffic, high speed, low speed, residential parking lots, things like that. Permeable pavements, however, right now are best used in residential areas. So low traffic, low speeds, and parking lots. The designs are not quite ready for the high speed, high traffic areas like our freeways and interstates. They just can't hold up to the loads and the traffic frequency and the speed of it. So they are continually improving and they are getting better over time, but just not quite ready for that.
How does road heave and potholes on permeable pavement compared to non-permeable pavement?
Yeah, that's another good question. So if you think about heave, you know, a big question or a big barrier initially to permeable pavements in Minnesota was, if we put water in the pavement, are we going to get more frost heave? And that just hasn't been demonstrated or seen anywhere. So if the water can melt and go through the surface, the pavement itself and then the subbase below is typically anywhere from 1 to 3 feet or more of open rock. And that allows the water to actually flow all the way down below the frost line and soak into the ground. So there's no issues with frost heave by water soaking into the pavement. And there's less occurrences of potholes, because as I showed in the slides, you don't have water standing on the surface. And a pothole happens or builds and grows substantially when you have a very small hole filled with water and you have cars going over it and over and over it again. So the water action and the tire action just makes a big hole. So we just don't see that in permeable pavements. But again, we're not using them on highways, so it's not necessarily a fair comparison.
And how does one make permeable asphalt?
Yeah, another good question. The primary difference between a permeable asphalt and a conventional asphalt is there's aggregate, and then there's the binder or the glue that makes a pavement. And the aggregate, all the sediment that's in there in a permeable pavement, does not have the smallest sizes. It really only has coarse aggregate in the mix. So if you were to look at a conventional pavement and a permeable pavement, you look at the conventional pavement, you'd see large rocks and you'd see a lot of small rocks. In the permeable pavement, you would only see the large rocks and then open pores or open spaces for the water to flow through. But otherwise, they are made almost identically.
All right, we've reached the bottom of our Q&A. Is there anybody else out there? Or, 116. Joelle, I'm handing it back to you.
Hi, thanks everyone for sticking around to the end of the Q&A, and thanks very much to Andy and our silent partner, Chris Millerin, who typed a lot of the answers into the Q&A so we were able to get through a bit more of the questions. Thanks again, all of you, for attending. I've got just a couple final slides with a bit of final resource information. I think this was already put in the chat, but if you want to learn more about SAFL, it's safl.umn.edu. And if you're looking for other ways to get engaged with the College of Science and Engineering, including other upcoming events, you can go to csc.umn.edu/alumni. And we try to keep everything as up to date there as we can. And I will also be including these links and others in the follow-up email I'll send out with the link to the video next week. And finally, if you have any questions, the ones to direct to SAFL should go to Barbara at safl@umn.edu. And if you have any questions for me about upcoming events or volunteer opportunities with the college, you can email cscalumni@umn.edu. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and a big round of applause for all of our researchers and presenters today. Thank you so much for making the time to give us a little peek behind the curtain at what happens in SAFL and the really wide variety of research you guys are all able to do to make our world a better place. So thank you all for giving your time, and thank you to everyone who attended today. Take care, and we'll see you at another event soon.